Last week, the Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the Texas voter ID law violated the Voting Rights Act. The state has yet to file an appeal.
Well, now a new study from Rice University says it did, in fact, keep some voters away from the polls. So joining us now from Rice University is political science professor Mark Jones. Professor Jones, thank you as usual for being with us. How significant was this? Did the voting rights, or did this voter ID law keep a lot of people away from the polls?
Well, our study focused on District 23, which runs from the San Antonio suburbs all the way down to the border and out to El Paso. In that district, we found that about 1 out of every 10 registered voters stayed away from the polls on Election Day last November, at least in part due to the voter ID law. Although only about 1 out of every 10 of them, that is about 1% of the voters, actually didn't have the proper ID they needed to cast a vote in person.
So, Mark, we know this was your study and you put a lot of time into it, and I'm wondering the reason why, I understand from your study it discouraged about 9% of voters according to your research. Was it a language barrier or was it confusion over the ID? What was it?
Well, mostly it was a lack of understanding of what was required under the law. So people knew enough to know that there was a voter ID law and that it was strict and that they needed a photo ID, but they didn't have a good idea about what exact form of ID would be used. And we found, though, that most of them actually had the right ID to vote in person. They just believed, unfortunately, that they did not.
So now the appeals court has struck down the law. I believe it's still in effect in some way as this still moves through the legal process. What do you think should happen?
Well, I think this is like the Texas voter ID law was struck down by the Fifth Circuit Court in New Orleans. It's gone back to the judge in Corpus Christi, who issued the initial ruling that was unconstitutional. Odds are the state's going to appeal it, and it's eventually going to wind its way to the Supreme Court. The only question is, will the Supreme Court have time to make the decision before we enter the November 26th election season in order to decide one way or another whether our voter ID law is constitutional or if it's unconstitutional?
Mark, I'll ask you to put on your researcher hat and your political analyst hat at the same time. Do you think that, obviously there was some confusion for the people that you studied from the 23rd Congressional District. Do you think there was a good effort to make the guidelines clear to voters?
Well, I think the state's effort was insufficient. The state, in a response actually to the study, made the case that it actually spent $2 million on voter education. The $2 million in Texas is a drop in the bucket. The Pete Gallego campaign in CD23, that's just one candidate in one district. He spent more than $2 million on his own campaign, and his district is one of only 36 in Texas. So I think if the ID law stays in force, the state's going to have to spend a lot more time and a lot greater effort with the assistance of the media and nonprofit groups in educating the Texas public about the requirements under the voter ID law so that as few people as possible don't turn out to vote or don't turn out to vote when they actually had the ID in their possession.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a simple enough thing, right? As a state, you want people who are the actual voters to vote. Right. And other states have managed to have voter ID laws that aren't deemed unconstitutional. So what is the state, beyond the education you're talking about, do they need to change the way the law works to make it constitutional in your view?
Well, right. The reason why they say that Texas's law is the strictest in the nation is that the forms of ID that we allow people to use is relatively restricted. There are only 7 altogether. For instance, we don't allow people to use a student ID or a public employee ID or a public assistance ID the way in many states, including, for instance, Kansas, which is run by, or at least the father of most of these modern laws is the Kansas Secretary of State. Okay. So one remedy for Texas is to expand the number of IDs that people can use when they turn out to vote at the polls.
Mark, before we let you go, I'm curious. Were these potential voters Democrats or Republicans? Do you know?
At least in terms, they were primarily Democrats. For instance, in the case of Pete Gallego, who is the Democrat who lost, these people favored him 4 to 5 to 1 over his Republican opponent, who defeated him by 2,400 votes. A very narrow election victory.
All right. Mark Jones, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.